Good morning, good afternoon for everyone in many parts of the world, and I appreciate your effort to be available for this webinar. So I hope you all are in good health and safe. So my name is Nella Henrietti. I'm the task manager for this regional policy dialogue, trade and sustainability in the context of COVID-19 from ADBI side. So before we start our webinar, I would like to explain about the housekeeping rules. So for the speakers and panelists, please mute your microphone when you are not presenting, and please, if necessary, please switch off your video. So you see the button for the microphone. Midori, go to the next slide. The button for microphone and video are on the left button on your screen. And then if you have a question related to the topic of our discussion, please type your question in Q&A. And there's a, and then if you want to chat with the host or other participant, use the chat box. So, and then if you want to ask question directly, please raise your hand and we will monitor that. So, so when it's your turn to present, you can choose that you are the one that control the screen, or you can ask us, the host, to do that. So if you control the screen, you can show your presentation by click the share button located at the bottom of your meeting window, or select the file from your computer and open. And for PPT, please choose the slideshow mode, and don't forget to click the share button located on the right side of the bottom. So, and then you will see the share screen menu on the top of your screen. If you choose annotate, you can choose some tools such as Spotlight as pointers. So at the end, don't forget to stop share after your presentation. So now for the attendee or participant, no video or audio. Please type your question related to the topic in Q&A. We will monitor that Q&A box all the time. So you can raise your hand if you want to ask the question directly, and our team will give you access to the microphone to talk. So I think for the housekeeping, I think that's all. And then now we are about to start our webinar. So we have our two speakers for our opening remarks today. We have Dean Sonobe, and we have Karsten from WTO. So first, I would like to introduce Dean Tatsushi Sonobe. He is the Dean and CEO for the Asian Development Bank Institute. He has his PhD in economics from Yale University and BA in economics from University of Tokyo. So before joining ADBI, Dean Sonobe also served as Vice President in National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, and also he recipient of the Nikkei Book Publication Prize and the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Prize. And I think without further ado, I would like to invite our Dean of IDBI, Dean Sonobe, to come forward and begin our session. Dean Sonobe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nera. Okay, so, right. So, hello everyone. Welcome all of you to this important workshop on behalf of ADB Institute, one of the three organizers. The workshop has 4 sessions, including this opening session, over 3 days. In this session, Director Lim of Trade and Environmental Division, the World Trade Organization, another co-organizer, delivers his welcoming remarks. And Vice President Bambam Santono of Asian Development Bank, also a co-organizer, will offer a keynote speech entitled How to Leverage Trade to Fight Against and Recover from COVID-19 for about 40 minutes. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought a major disruption to international trade. Governments as well as private companies have made great efforts to mitigate its negative impacts on production and distribution of essential goods, such as personal protective equipment and food, and to find a way to maintain income-generating activities. These efforts had many successes, but also many failures. The first session, which will be held right after this opening session, is intended to help to have better understanding of these of the lessons from these good practices and failures of adjusting standards and regulations in response to the outbreak of the pandemic. Since international trade has always been the driver of economic, social, and cultural development and technological progress, as well as economic growth, it will be the booster, or it should be the booster of economic recovery, or the process of building back better. So session 2, which will be held on Thursday, November 12th, will be about the roles of WTO in steering global recovery and environmental sustainability. The third session is about tourism. The tourism sector was the most dynamic sector of many economies in Asia and the Pacific and other regions, but it has been hit hardest by the pandemic. So how to rebuild the sector is a very urgent policy issue, policy agenda for this region in Asia and the Pacific and some others. So the third session we discuss about this. So this a very useful 3-day dialogue of trade and trade policies will bring together the researchers of academia, including the Professor Harhill, and then the think tanks, and also senior government officials. So this is very, not only useful, but intellectually very stimulating. And I think this kind of collaboration with international organizations like ADB and the WTO and ADB Institute as a think tank of ADB will be very useful, not only this time, but in the future. So we will have more and more important events like this. And then for this this event, many people have been working very hard. So I welcome, I really appreciate the great efforts by Dr. Matthias Helber of ADB and Mr. Carsten Steinfurt of WTO, as well as Nera Hendrietti of ADBI. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Bamban-san and Lim-san, for the delivering keynote speech and welcoming remarks after this. And then all the speakers from international organizations such as ADB, WTO, ASEAN Secretariat, UN Environmental Program, and the United Nations World Tourism Organizations, and then the Professor Harhill and other professors. So the eminent researchers from academics, and then other think tank, such as International Institute for Sustainable Development. Thank you very much for joining this important workshop. So with that, I welcome you again and congratulate you for being active part of this wonderful workshop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dean Sonobe. Now we continue to WTO welcome remarks, and then I just got the information that Mr. Ho Lim actually just get sick, so we asked Carsten Steinfurt to deliver the welcome remarks. Carsten has been with WTO Secretariat since 2011, and he before joining WTO, he worked on the trade issues and at the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. and the OECD. So without further ado, I give the floor to Carsten. Carsten, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah. Many thanks, Nella. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Karsten Steinfatt, and I'm a counselor at the Trade and Environment Division of the World Trade Organization. I'm very pleased to deliver these welcoming remarks on behalf of my director, Mr. Eek Ho Lim, who unfortunately cannot be with us today due to medical reasons. So ADBI Dean Sonobe, ADBI Vice President Susantono, distinguished participants, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the WTO, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this policy dialogue on trade and sustainability in the context of COVID-19. At the WTO, we are very pleased to collaborate with ADB and ADBI to host this event. I want to acknowledge the excellent cooperation with colleagues in these two institutions, in particular with my colleague Matthias Helble from ADB, who had the original idea about a joint workshop with the WTO, and to Nella Henrietti and her wonderful team at ADBI for their great efforts to turn this idea into reality. COVID-19 is a global public health crisis, but with lots of implications for international trade, as was just noted. The pandemic has focused attention on the highly interconnected nature of the world economy. Given the immediate human suffering caused by COVID-19 itself, it is only natural that recent attention has focused on the role of trade in supporting efforts to fight the pandemic, for example, by helping ensure the supply of medical goods. While we confront the pandemic, we must also consider how to safeguard prosperity after COVID-19 in the longer term. There are multiple risks looming, many of them related to environmental degradation, from climate change to biodiversity loss, and from plastics pollution to ocean health. These challenges require coordinated and integrated responses and action from across governments, and indeed from all stakeholders, not just environment ministries or the environmental community. Trade and trade policies can and must play a role. Indeed, trade policies have a huge potential to promote environmental sustainability and efforts to build back better. To turn this potential into reality, however, more and better cooperation is needed between trade and environment policy officials at all levels, national, regional, and global. And let us not forget that strengthening cooperation cannot come soon enough. Scientists tell us that environmental challenges could cause social and economic damages far larger than those caused by COVID-19. All policy areas, including trade, must work together and pull in the same direction to bolster sustainability. These policy dialogues have been designed with this urgent task in mind. They seek to trigger a discussion amongst yourselves, the participants, on how trade can work hand in hand with environmental and other policies to promote sustainable development. During the first dialogue later today, you will look more closely at the medical goods supply chain, including its operation during the pandemic, the regulatory measures taken by countries in the context of COVID-19, and the emerging policy issues in this sector. The second policy dialogue on Thursday will look at the question of trade and environmental sustainability. You will explore the environmental impact of global value chains and possible actions to make those supply chains more resilient to all kinds of shocks, including environmental ones. These issues are attracting growing attention at the WTO and in many, many global policy discourse forums more generally. On Friday, you will turn your attention to the tourism sector, a key sector for many economies in Asia and indeed the world. You will be looking at the challenges the sector is facing as a result of the pandemic and ways that the sector can and must reinvent itself as a source of sustainable and inclusive development, including decent jobs. For each of the dialogues this week, you are very fortunate to have a very impressive lineup of keynote speakers and panelists with whom to discuss these issues. I would encourage you to engage with them and with each other by asking questions, sharing your national experiences, and testing new ideas. The virtual format of the dialogues should not keep us from making this event as interactive as possible. Exchange amongst yourselves, the participants, is often the most valuable element of capacity building. I sincerely hope that by the end of the week, you will have developed a greater recognition of the role of trade and trade policy in achieving a sustainable and inclusive economy, and in building back greener and better from the COVID-19 crisis. And after this week, I would encourage you also to continue engaging with each other and build on the relationships that will hopefully be created over the next few days. So let me wish you a very productive and enjoyable week. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carsten. Then I think we will go to the keynote speech. Dr. Bambang Susantono will talk about how to leverage trade to fight and recover from COVID-19. Dr. Bambang Susantono is the Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development of the Asian Development Bank. He coordinates research and studies on wide-ranging topics from energy and transport to health and finance, in addition to climate change, education, environment, and governance. Governance, gender equality, almost all that's under knowledge management under his supervision. So he served as Acting Minister of Transportation of Indonesia and as Deputy Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development and the Office of Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. He holds a PhD in infrastructure planning as well as master degree in transportation engineering and city and regional planning from UC Berkeley and bachelor in engineering from the Bandung Institute of Technology. So I think without further ado, I will give the floor to VP Bambang Susantono. Bambang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for a generous introduction, Nella. Dean Sonobe, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to join all of you today at this first joint policy dialogue between ADB, ADBI, and the WTO. I would like first to thank the organizer, especially to Nella, Matthias, and Carsten for their hard work in making this dialogue possible. Before discussing the COVID-19 impact on trade and economic recovery, let me begin with a historical perspective on trade's role in economic development. As you can see, for the most part, global trade has grown steadily since 1960. Since the European Free Trade Association was established in 1960, many global and regional initiatives have pushed global trade forward. These include creating the ASEAN Free Trade Area in 1992, the European Union Single Market in 1993, NAFTA in 1994, the WTO in 1995, and up to 2018, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. World trade is today the most important part of the global economy. In percent of GDP, it rose from 25% in 1960 to around 60% in 2015. But it is clear that this growth has been slowing in recent years. The Asia and Pacific region has done remarkably well by embracing openness. In 1965, the Asia's share of global GDP was 13%. A little over half a century later, in 2018, it had jumped to 33%. At the same time, real GDP per capita rose more than 5 times to $6,255, while lifting more than 1 billion people out of poverty. Most economies in the region reach middle income status by now. Increasing international trade and foreign direct investment played major roles in region's development and economic transformations. The region's growth in trade and goods and services averaged 9% annually from 1990 to 2018. The trade to GDP ratio rose from 17% in 1965 to 53% in 2018. Just as important was the significant shift in the composition of trade. Over time, exports shifted from mostly raw materials and agricultural products to industrial goods. Today, the region's top exports range from labor-intensive textile to sophisticated capital and skill-intensive electronics, automotive products, and heavy machinery, along with high-tech products such as computer and semiconductors. Nowhere else can we see both regional and global value chains more vibrantly at play than in Asia and the Pacific. Our early vision of economic openness led to APEC's 1994 Bogor goals of free and open trade and investment. It has been instrumental in advancing initiatives that supported these goals. Many of them, from trade and investment liberalizations to expanding business opportunity, are critical for a seamless and comprehensive, connected, and integrated Asia and Pacific. Data on value-added goods and services trade shows that the degree of interconnectedness among the region economies is even stronger than what traditional trade statistics show. Based on ADB estimates, more than 80% of the value additions embedded in intra-regional trade originated from the region itself. As businesses went global, the prevalence of supply chain networks undoubtedly deepened these trade and investment linkages. Let me move on to the impact of COVID-19 has had on the region's economy and trade. Asian governments responded to the pandemic with a range of containment measures. Their stringency differed across economies and over time. This chart uses the Oxford University Government Response Stringency Index to illustrate the strength of measures taken. The left graph, as you can see here, shows that the lockdowns and closure were most intense from March to May. These have since been eased across much of developing Asia and are now less strict than during the second quarter. On the right graph, you can see how they varied across and within subregions. The containment measures significantly reduced people mobility and, along with precautionary behavior, cut into domestic economic activity. Our latest forecast show that developing Asia's GDP will contract by 0.7% of this year. That is down 2.9 percentage points from our April 2.2% growth forecast and 0.8 percentage points of the 0.1% growth forecast in June. This will be the first regional contraction since the early 1960s. We do forecast regional growth will rebound strongly in 2021 to 6.8%, but this still leaves 2021 GDP substantially below our pre-COVID expectations, as shown in the chart on the right. In other words, we do not expect a V-shaped recovery, but rather more L-shaped or the Nike-shaped recovery pattern. The pandemic clearly affected external economic activity. Regional and global trade plunged during the second quarter of 2020, with the global trade down close to 20% year-on-year in April and May. The collapse was even bigger for trade in the US, Europe, and Japan, or G3. Their aggregate export fell by about 20% year-on-year. As you can see, developing Asia trade also fell, but by less. Asia's import declined by 12% year-on-year in May, as declining domestic activity reduced import demand. Asia's export contracted even less in May by 9%. Part of this was due to increased export in health supplies and equipment, particularly from the People Republic of China, and increased electronic export by economies such as People Republic of China and Taipei, China. At the start of the pandemic, trade restriction and export bans severely interrupted international supply chains. But governments quickly realized the crucial role trade plays in balancing the swing in demand and supply and filling in domestic gap. The economies that struggle more could import critical goods from other economies which were able to continue productions. Many of the early trade restrictions have been lifted as government recognized that keeping borders open was vital to ensure adequate supply of critical goods, such as personnel, protective equipment. So let me share with you how ADB responded to the pandemic. We have been proactive in assisting our developing members during the crisis. In April, we launched a $20 billion comprehensive support package to help fight COVID-19. Since then, we have committed $11.9 billion through grants and loans to both government and to private companies. This includes our COVID-19 pandemic response option, or we call it CPRO, created under the existing counter-cyclical support facility for helping fiscal stimulus in response to macroeconomic crisis. All ADB developing member countries are eligible for a CPRO. An individual country can avail of up to $1.5 billion. The main requirement for a CPRO is that government has an effective counter-cyclical development policy program, and that it includes measures directly addressing COVID-19 related impacts, particularly those on poor or vulnerable groups. As part of the $20 billion support package, ADB has also expanded its trade finance program. Since April, it has supported more than 3,200 transactions valued at $2.7 billion, with about $1 billion co-finance. This transaction included 187 for test kits, medical equipment, medicines, and other goods, worth $45 million, as well as 715 food security and agricultural related transactions valued at $644 million. Our trade finance program added 4 new bank partners in Nepal, Papua New Guinea, and Uzbekistan, and concluded 8 new loan agreements in Bangladesh, Georgia, Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. The pandemic exposed some deep, dangerous fault lines in global supply chains. As countries locked down, healthcare authorities and government were left scrambling to find the products they needed. Those efforts were hampered by a lack of readily accessible information on supply chains for this crucial product. Our trade finance program and supply chain finance program are helping resolve this using a new online tool that maps out critical supply chains, including those for vaccine productions. It allows government, banks, investors, and healthcare professionals to pinpoint companies making this product and intervene early to clear blockages. We are also supporting ASEAN and its sub-regional frameworks intensify regional cooperations on COVID-19 and vaccine security. We support the collective move toward Asian vaccine security and self-reliance as adopted by the Asian leaders in Bangkok a year ago in November. We are also supporting the expansions of the mutual recognition arrangement for good manufacturing practice certifications, which helps the licensing and registration decisions of national drug regulatory agencies. We also support the proposed ASEAN Plastic Reserve of essential medical supplies to enhance cooperations in medical supply chains, including vaccines. Finally, to contain the threat of future pandemics, ADB also supports a stronger ASEAN regional disease surveillance system, including a planned ASEAN Center for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases. So, what could be the visions for the future? As we have seen, trade has been crucial in fighting the pandemic and looking ahead. It will be vital for economic recovery. Yet, the pandemic will have lasting impact on how we trade and do business across borders. First, the pandemic has accelerated the digital transformations across Asia and the Pacific. This has profound implications for international trade. For example, agricultural businesses, including those of small farmers, tried new ways to market their produce by offering them directly to consumers online. Using online platforms to sell products domestically is a first big step towards selling internationally and linking up to the global value chains. In the years to come, we will see digital trade will help provide new growth opportunity to companies, especially small firms throughout the regions. So clearly, COVID-19 has changed the way we work. Many of us have seen our workplaces shifting from office buildings to home offices. Many companies have seen that an employee's physical presence is no longer essential. Modern information and telecommunication technology allow us to work together remotely and productively. These work arrangements may not be feasible for all jobs in all economic sectors, but the potential is enormous. Most jobs done remotely within countries can also be carried out across borders. The digital transformations triggered by COVID-19 will thus spur services trade under the Mode 1 type of WTO's General Agreement on Trade and Services. This means that services are supplied from one country to the other through telecommunications or postal infrastructure and without people having to cross borders. This type of trade in services holds many opportunities for developing countries during the pandemic, as services can be delivered remotely. To ensure these opportunities translate into gains for larger population segments, governments also need to invest heavily to improve the quality of education and vocational training. With accelerating technological advance through artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, and others, routine jobs in services will no longer require heavy human capital inputs. It is therefore crucial that the workforce has the skill set to undertake complex tasks using adroit technologies and knowledge. We expect well-trained workers in developing countries can work remotely and find well-paid jobs in services. A global trade analysis project simulation shows that increased digitalizations will have a tremendous impact on growth, trade, and employment. Globally, if the digital sector in 2025 is 20% higher than the 2020 baseline scenario, and total factor productivity increased by 2%, global GDP will increase by $6.8 trillion, the equivalent of 8.6% of global GDP in 2020. About 41% of this increase will be in Asia, where output will increase by $2.7 trillion or 9.4% of its 2020 regional GDP. Similarly, in the medium-term scenario, global trade will expand by $3 trillion, equivalent to 7.1% of total 2020 trade. At least about a third of this trade increases will be in Asia, where trade will increase by $1.2 trillion or 8% of regional trade in 2020. In addition, the pandemic will likely stimulate the reorganizations of international supply chains. Firms have realized that the over-reliance on a limited number of suppliers carries high risk during a natural or health disaster. Multinational companies will likely lead efforts to diversify supply chains and thus increase their robustness. This is a departure from traditional just-in-time supply chain management. Developing countries will benefit from this trend if they can offer viable options for production and tradable goods and services. So despite its devastating effect, COVID-19 has accelerated transformation and boosted opportunities. However, any gains will not be automatic. Trade can be effectively leveraged to fight the pandemic by keeping borders open for the trade in goods. Access to affordable internet needs to expand. To reap the benefit of expanded and diversified value chains, more investment are needed to build reliable and efficient physical transport infrastructure to support the seamless flow of goods. Besides hard infrastructure, soft logistics also must improve. This can happen by modernizing port, airport, and border crossing management information system, by facilitating digital and paperless trade, and by simplifying administrative procedure through measures like single window system. Finally, regional cooperations and integration should be enhanced through regulatory harmonizations and policy coordinations. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the challenges of the pandemic remain unprecedented, but we can transform this into opportunity by seizing the momentum of evolving global value chains and by embracing the potential offered by technologies and services trade. And ADB stands ready to help governments during this transition. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pak Bambang. Very impressive and optimist keynote speech that how we need to harness the benefit of this momentum and how COVID-19 actually boosts the digital transformation. And then we expect this will be like kind of like significant growth that for the global growth on 2025, and then that will be like most of that 25% increase will be from Asia. So thank you very much, and then I think we will take note of that, and then we will use your keynote speech for the whole session and this 3 days webinar. So I think now we are about to start our session 1, but before that, I think we will have a photo session. So please allow me to ask you to turn on, to switch on your video for all speakers, moderator, and discussion, and then we will take your video, your pictures. Swati, take picture. Okay, give 3, 2, 1. Swati.
Yeah, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, let me do that. 3, 2, 1. I still see someone open. Okay, one more. Okay, thank you everyone. Now we can start our, we can go to our first session. The moderator for the session will be Mr. Cho Joo Kim. He's Deputy Dean of ADBI. He was a secretary to the country's president for economic and financial affairs of Republic of Korea before he joined ADBI. And he also Deputy Minister for Planning and Coordination, Director General of Economic Policy Bureau, and Director General of the Public Policy Bureau, Ministry of Strategy and Finance. So he has extensive experience in international development and then specifically in World Bank and ADB. So he held BA from Seoul National University, Republic of Korea, and Georgia State Master degree in Georgia State University, USA. Without further ado, Didi Kim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Nella, for the very generous introduction. As introduced, I'm Cho Joo Kim, Deputy Dean of ADB Institute. I must say, very honored to be a moderator of the very first session of this important policy dialogue jointly organized with ADB and WTO and ADBI. As we heard in the opening remarks by Dean Sonobe and Karsten of WTO, and also very inspiring keynote speech by VP Bambang, COVID-19 is an unprecedented global public health crisis. And at the same time, it has tremendous implications for international trade and economic activities, as we are witnessing every day. This pandemic has brought about renewed attention to the interconnectedness of the global economy. This pandemic has brought renewed attention to the critical role of the global value chain and the digital transformation to promote economic activities. And also it has brought about renewed attention to the importance of regulations, standards, and cooperation, regional and international, to promote trade in COVID-19, especially medical goods, and more broadly in other areas to safeguard prosperity for longer term. This session will explore the role of trade in supporting worldwide efforts to fight against the pandemic, along with concrete steps taken by countries to avoid unnecessary disruptions to the global supply chain, and that produce medical equipment, vaccines, and other essential medical goods. This session will also focus on the emerging regulatory and policy issues to this end. I'm very pleased that we have a fantastic mix of speakers who are all outstanding experts in this topic from ADB, WTO, ASEAN Secretariat, consultancy, and government. So before going into the presentations, please write down the questions and comments you have in the Q&A box, or if you want to directly speak to presenters, please click on the raise your hand button, then we will give you the chance to address directly. Without further ado, let me invite first speaker, Shin-Young Park, Director of Regional Cooperation and Integration Division at the ERCD ADBI, who will talk about the global shortage of personal protective equipment amid COVID-19. As a well-known economist at ADB, Shin-Young has been a main author and contributor to ADB's flagship publications such as Asian Development Outlook, Asian Economic Integration Report. Her works also appeared in Journal of Banking and Finance and Journal of Financial Stability and the Journal of Futures Market. Quite impressive. She received her PhD in economics from the Columbia University and worked as an economist at OECD before joining the ADB. So Shin-Young, floor is yours. So because of the time constraints, can you make your presentation around 10 to 12 minutes?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kim, for a very nice introduction. I'll present this global shortage of personal protective equipment during COVID-19, which is based on the latest policy brief we prepared during the outbreak of the coronavirus. And next slide, please. Well, the shortage of the PPE, the personal protective gears, have been quite significant and exposed vulnerabilities of global supply chain of critical goods, including the medical devices and then pharmaceuticals. This is recognized around the world, as you see in the headlines of the newspapers all around the world. Next slide, please. The COVID outbreak has caused significant disruptions throughout the PPE supply chains, both domestically and internationally. It even starts from shortage of raw materials. The facial masks, the medical masks usually require this non-woven polypropylene fabric, and then this has been concentrated among suppliers in France and then a lot of European countries. And manufacturing has been done quite predominantly in China and across Southeast Asia and Asia, and that has been also disrupted due to the disruptions in the supply chain, and distribution have been also disrupted. Also added disruption came from the trade restrictions in response to COVID by many countries, and end users also showed a very strong demand for this PPE at the outbreak of COVID-19. So next slide, please. Next, the PPE production in Asia, as you can see, are highly concentrated. The surgical masks, protective suits, and then protective goggles and surgical gloves are all quite significantly focused in Asia and then Chinese manufacturers. And especially you can see that China have been playing the major suppliers for not only Asia, but to Europe and USA. Next slide, please. And over time, as you have seen also in the supply chain involvement in the VP Bambang's presentation, since 2000 until like 2018, so over nearly past 2 decades, there have been a substantial growth and role of the China and Asia in a global supply chain for these personal protective equipment, and especially surgical masks, as well as the medical devices. Next slide, please. And at the outbreak of the COVID-19, in fact, many countries have imposed both trade restrictions, export restrictions, and import facilitation. By end May 2020, there were about 250 trade-related measures, both comprising its restrictions on exports by the WTO members, as well as import facilitation to help the supply of intermediate goods, and then also trying to promote some of the imports of these PPE supplies from overseas. Next slide, please. And Many countries have made strong efforts to ramp up PPE production. In some countries, including China and also US, they have tried to repurpose the firms that were not really producing the facial mask or the surgical masks to supply more medical materials, especially the facial masks. And across many countries, the financial support have been provided to the small, medium size of the manufacturers for these medical equipments. Next slide, please. And there have been also many trade measures to expedite the access to PPEs. The WTO and then also the G members, as well as the G20 leaders, have shown strong political commitments to keep markets open. But in reality, there have been a bit of opaqueness in the trade and also the export markets. This actually shows that there's a need to improve the transparency. As also mentioned that as a part of import facilitation, duties, taxes, charges on critical medical goods and then other essential supplies have been temporarily waived and lifted. And many countries have also streamlined customs procedures and border clearance for critical medical goods. And they have cut back red tapes and trying to establish green lanes. And also they have expedited regulatory approval and try to strengthen cooperation on standards for trade goods through the mutual recognition of rules, as well as the mutual recognition of conformity assessments. Next slide, please. ADB has been providing very immediate and strong support in response to COVID-19. We have provided the COVID assistance packages to meet the needs of developing member countries and economies, as well as providing supply chain finance and trade finance programs to mobilize the financial support for especially the SMEs that are major producers and distributors of these PPEs. Next slide, please. And this is another, the ADB effort to facilitate some of these supply chain movements by providing the locations and information of supply chain participants, including the banks, investors, governments, and then also healthcare professionals to also identify who will be the the suppliers nearby, and then we'll be able to help mobilize the flows of medical supplies and then PPEs. Next slide, please. We learned quite important policy lessons from past health crisis. We have noted that it is very important to monitor the use and distribution of these critical medical goods and improve the visibility on orders that are placed in markets. And it's important to enhance supply chain resilience through sharing information of stockpiles and sharing responsibility, and improve domestic manufacturing surge capacity for the urgent crisis event, and finally share information and communicate regularly around the demand and supply conditions of critical goods. And finally, next slide, please. Next, this is my last slide. For future supply chain, we need to really strengthen the resilience through diverse sourcing and using the technology through digitization. Global firms will likely diversify their supply chains. They will likely reduce concentration and trying to reorient supply chains of essential goods toward more strategically aligned countries, which actually requires much more cooperation and information sharing among the countries that share the common supply chains. We need to incentivize firms to produce critical items at home, but and also increase the domestic and regional sourcing, but the trade will still remain the essential part. And we need to improve the logistics chain through supply by establishing the digital supply networks, digitizing the buyer-supplier relationship, which is still predominantly paper-based in many developing countries. Okay, thank you. This wraps up my presentation.
Thank you, Xingyang. Very informative presentation on called PPE. So you touched upon the recent trend of PPE trade and also the future of supply chain with regard to the PPE, diversification and incentivization of firms and digital supply chain. I think all points are well taken. So I'm sure the audience will have questions to your presentation, but let's leave it to the after for the time being. After we hearing all the presentation, we will pick a couple of questions and so on. Then next, on the topic of trade facilitation and vaccines, Ben Shepherd, who is a principal at the Developing Trade Consultancy, will deliver a pre-recorded presentation. Let me briefly introduce the Ben. The Ben is a trade economist at International Development Consultant and has worked on a wide range of trade and development issues, especially in cooperation with organizations including World Bank, OECD, ADB, and IADB, and United Nations, and so on. And he specializes in providing policy relevant research, and as well as capacity building seminars for researchers working in trade and development. Also, the Matthias will be ready to answer any of the questions related to Ben's presentation. So Nella, can you show the Ben's recording?
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me and also for allowing me to participate via recording. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I am happy to be able to contribute this presentation. I'm going to say a few words on the subject of trade facilitation and vaccines. To do that, I think we need to start by talking about what I actually mean by trade facilitation. Now, as many in the room are probably aware, there are numerous different definitions that are around both in the technical literature and also in the policy space. What I've tried to do here is summarise some of the different approaches that we see, ranging from the most narrow, in which we use trade facilitation to refer to the simplification of border procedures, that is to say, speeding up the movement of goods across borders, then into a broader range of meanings where we start talking about trade facilitation as measures that reduce trade costs. And then what I'm talking about is kind of a new generation approach to trade facilitation, which is where we use three concepts of time, cost, and uncertainty. And so what trade facilitation is trying to do is reduce the time, reduce the cost, and reduce the uncertainty associated with import-export transactions. Now, the WTO's approach in the Trade Facilitation Agreement is very much within the narrow sense. It's focusing on border procedures. If we think about forums like APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, then they've historically had a much broader approach. In fact, their original approach to trade facilitation was notably aligned with what I'm calling here the broad sense. And then their new set of documents focused on supply chain connectivity really gets into this kind of new generation trade facilitation that's right at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, I think the reason for focusing on these broader definitions is they're actually closer to core concepts that economists use when they're modelling trade and when we're thinking about what determines bilateral trade between countries. Something like trade costs is something that economists understand very well. And we know that it goes much further than just broader border procedures. So what I'm going to say about the links between trade facilitation and vaccines, I'm going to be speaking mostly in this broader sense of trade facilitation. Okay, so let's talk about vaccines. I'm not sure if when you see the title of this presentation, the link is immediately clear to you as to what the connection might be between trade facilitation on the one hand and vaccines on the other. Now, we know from work that's already out there that trade in health products, broadly speaking, that is to say all kinds of health products, from pharmaceuticals to bandages to surgical equipment to imaging equipment, it's actually a pretty significant amount of trade in a dollar sense. Now, vaccination as a public health objective, of course, has a very long history. We've seen some important successes, particularly in a development context, in the context of vaccines. And I think there's obviously renewed interest in the vaccination side of the equation when we think of the current pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. There are going to be vaccines. Notice that I speak in plural. There's going to be more than one. They're being tested. When those tests are completed and we are assured that the vaccines are both effective and safe, the question of distribution inevitably arises. Now, there's a question of distribution within countries, but there's also the question of distribution between countries, because this is a global pandemic. So obviously the vaccines need to be distributed globally. They won't be manufactured separately in each country. Not every country has the capacity to manufacture these vaccines. So the movement of these goods across borders is actually a crucial part of dealing with the global pandemic that we face. And as I've highlighted there are two senses in which we need to think about the ways in which vaccines move. One is the international movement, where we're actually crossing a border, going from one country to another. Then the second dimension is the internal movement. So that is to say, moving vaccines from a port or airport where they arrive in a country out to the hinterland. Now, to put some numbers on this, I've got some data here from UN Comtrade. As of 2019, world trade in vaccines totaled about $30 billion, a little bit under $30 billion. Now, you can see on the left-hand side of the chart the breakdown by pair of country income groups. So what that's showing, the first column, for example, shows that most of the imports of vaccines in high-income countries, in fact, come from other high-income countries. But what I'd like you to take away from the slide is, firstly, that there is this $30 billion worth of trade in vaccines. Yes, it is concentrated among high-income countries. They account for about 80% of that total. But there are substantial amounts of trade going on in other directions. And when we look at the low and middle income countries, we see, of course, that they are importing substantial quantities of vaccines, both from high-income economies, that is to say north-south trade, but also increasingly from low and middle income economies themselves, that is to say south-south trade. So this issue of moving vaccines internationally, yes, it's important in the context of a global pandemic like COVID-19, but it's also got an importance quite apart from that when we're just talking about the more routine vaccinations that we associate with current medical practice, whether it's a vaccine like DPT, that is to say diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, whether it's the flu vaccine or whether it's one of these other hepatitis vaccines, all of the typical vaccines that we receive. Okay, so why talk about trade facilitation in the context of vaccines? Well, quite apart from the issue of the very general point that better trade facilitation means that goods move more easily between countries, reducing prices, increasing quantities. there's actually a special way in which trade facilitation is linked to vaccines. And that is because of the special handling that many vaccines require when they're being moved. So they need to be kept often under controlled circumstances. Often there's some degree of cold chain management involved. Now, whether that is going to apply to the COVID-19 vaccines, I don't know. That's not my area of specialization. But even simply in terms of the fragility of moving doses of vaccines, we can understand that in an environment where trade facilitation is challenging and where logistics markets are underdeveloped, these operations are going to be very difficult. There may be loss of product, there may be vaccine that's rendered ineffective because it's stored at an incorrect temperature. So we would expect that quite beyond just the general point that we make about trade facilitation, increasing the quantity of goods that is traded, reducing the prices of those goods, both of which, of course, are important for vaccines, there is this added dimension of actually handling the vaccines themselves. So that's the idea. Is there any empirical evidence to support the fact that performance in an area like trade facilitation, and I'm using it a bit interchangeably here with logistics, is actually associated with more effective vaccination programs? Well, the answer is yes. Here's a plot. On the y-axis, we have the rate of DPT vaccination. So again, that's diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. It's a standard childhood vaccination. And we have the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, Logistics Competence Score on the x-axis. The countries are divided up there by colour groups between the different income groups. And I've put a smoothed regression line through those points. So what you can see is that there is a clear positive association between logistics performance on the one hand and the rate of DPT vaccination on the other. So there's clearly a correlation between these two things. Probably a combination of those two effects that I'm talking about. One is just that trade facilitation makes it easier for goods to move back and forth. And then second is this special role that vaccines have in terms of the handling that they require. Now, I think a particularly important aspect of the graph is the left-hand side of it. We see that the link between better logistics performance and a higher rate of vaccination is actually strongest in the low and middle income countries. It drops off to be basically flat in the high income countries. But in the low and middle income countries, and particularly the low income countries, it's a really very sharp relationship. So we do see perhaps considerable prospect to improve vaccination outcomes by focusing on the ways in which we move them, both nationally and internationally. Now, you might say, of course, that's just a correlation, doesn't control for anything, and that's completely true. But there is work out there, some work that I've done with a co-author, where we actually did some econometrics and we controlled for other factors that are linked to vaccination, such as per capita income, such as government spending on healthcare. And we still found that the effect of logistics performance was positive and statistically significant. So the evidence does seem to be there to suggest that there is this link between better trade facilitation and more effective vaccination programs. And so I leave that with you as a thought. Particularly in this context of the COVID-19 pandemic, do we have scope to distribute vaccines more equitably and more fully, both around the world and within countries, by focusing on the ways in which trade facilitation and logistics markets operate? Now, if you'd like more details on this, Matthias and I have a chapter on trade and health in our book on trade and the Sustainable Development Goals. It's an Asian Development Bank, ADBI co-publication, freely available online. So if you're interested in knowing more, I do encourage you to look up that reference. Thanks again for listening to the presentation. Again, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm very grateful to the organisers, both for the invitation and for allowing me to do this remotely.
Okay, thanks, Ben, for the very nice presentation, even though you are not physically here. And then let me invite Matthias, who is the economist at ERCD, to complement the Ben's presentation. So Matthias has been with ADBI for 5 years, serving as co-chair of ADBI's research department and producing many influencing research and journal articles and books. Matthias, can you talk around 5 minutes?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to come in also on this very important topic. I would like to take it to a little bit of higher level, not only talk about vaccines and PPE, but give the participants a bit an overview of this trade and health nexus, because I think it's very important to really understand this relationship. And I will not talk for more than 5 minutes, then we can continue. So as we know, for health, we need more than the physical input. We also need, of course, health services that are delivered. And this graph nicely illustrates that from trade, we can basically expect 2 types of inputs into the health systems. One is more indirect and the other one is more direct. The indirect one comes from the fact, of course, that trade tends to generate economic growth, and economic growth helps to, of course, improve the health systems. We also have a linkage through harmful, hazardous substances that can also impact, of course, health. And then more and more important is also this link through the health system, through food, as we know that, of course, unhealthy food can also have an impact on the well-being. Now, when we go to the direct effect to the right side, Xinjiang and Ben, they have talked about the trade in medicines and related trade, so the PPEs. And in addition to that, we also have services that enter, of course, health systems. And so all this universe is covered actually by trade. And so trade can play a very important role to contribute to health. Now, when we look at health products, a couple of years back, I tried to find out which products enter actually the health system. And I identified 207 HS subheadings. And you can see it's medicines, bulk medicines. And also, if you go further along that graph, you also see this medical technology and equipment. When we look at the world trade in health products, we see that it's really dominated by the developed countries. And even though these health products are, of course, needed around the world, it's more a question of who has the purchasing power. And of course, the purchasing power is in the developed world. So you see a large share of this world trade in health products dominated by developed countries. We also looked in our publication that Ben has mentioned at the tariffs that are levied on health products. And here the blue bar shows the level of simple average applied tariffs in 2002, and then green 2008 and red 2014. And as you can see, the positive trend is that there was a fall in tariffs. However, we see several country groups where we still have relatively high tariffs on health products. And we argue that this is basically a tax on health, because these are very important products that everybody should have access to as cheap as possible. So we also find substantial variation behind these country groups. We have relatively high tariffs in countries like India and Pakistan, just to mention two in Asia. And we also have a lot of non-tariff measures. And I think Daniel, in his presentation, will talk about that more. So let me quickly also talk about trade and health services. We have the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which is a very important agreement that regulates the trade in services. And it has a lot of possibilities to protect public health. And it's up to the Ministries of Health and the Ministries of Commerce to come together and find the best way forward in terms of promoting trade, but also protecting public health. So let me just conclude. International trade is really crucial for the procurement of health products. We've seen this before the pandemic, but also during the pandemic, and we will certainly see it after the pandemic. It's a market that is dominated by developed countries. Tariffs are falling, but they're still substantive, especially in South Asia. We have seen from Ben's presentation that trade logistics is very important to deliver health services and also health products like vaccines. We also found in our research that the price of health products can be lowered by sourcing from various producers and also pooling purchases. And then finally, trade in health products and services is necessary, but not sufficient as a condition to improve health systems and health outcomes. We also need a strong domestic health system that delivers for all. That's all from my side. Thank you so much, Didi Kim, and thanks for the nice and kind introduction as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias, for the very well complementing the Ben's presentation, focusing on the trade in health products and trade in health services, and also those are kind of the one condition to support the health system, especially in the midst of the pandemic. Again, also the domestic health system should be strengthened in parallel with the promotion of the trade in health product and health services and so on. Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be many questions. Please stand by to answer the questions. And in the meantime, please, audience, please write down your questions and comments in the Q&A box and chat box so that we can have very interactive discussion session after all the presentation. Now, let's move on to the next the presenters. Finally, we have one discussant from government, who is Mr. Thomas Natalius Kerap from Indonesia, who will give us valuable country cases on the COVID-19 pandemic, its impact and policy response. Mr. Kerap is Senior Policy Analyst at the Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance of Indonesia. He has been working at the Ministry of Finance for past 15 years and has gathered wide experiences at various posts, including Subdivision of Asia Pacific Corporation, Subdivision of Investment, Subdivision of Macroeconomic Policy, Subdivision of Economic Model Development and Statistic Analysis, and so on. Mr. Kerap, our floor is yours. You have around 10 minutes. 10 to 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kim. I try to make my presentation in short time. First of all, I want to thank you, ADB institution, for the opportunity and invitation. And good afternoon for everyone. For today, I try to share Indonesian experience about the pandemic. COVID pandemic issue and some policy response. First of all, sorry. Okay. You already see my presentation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. As you may know, you already know and it already experienced by other countries, the health issues by the pandemic already create a domino effect to other areas such as social, real sector, and financial sector. In Indonesia itself, the pandemic COVID started in the beginning of March, and it's already increased so many cases and also spread to other regions, many regions. But by the time through the years. However, we found that the new cases is already decreased in the recent days. The impact itself, as in many countries, also create a negative impact to the real sector and also in financial sector. Basically, due to the negative impact to the real sector, which create non-performing loans and also liquidity problem in the banking sector. That's basically what the issue Indonesia have. I could share some recent statistic to show how the severe impact of the pandemic to our economy. The GDP growth has been faced negative growth in the second and third quarter. So basically, Indonesia having a recession. However, the latest, the third quarter GDP has been in relative rebound. Most of the rebound is due to government expenditure to help the economy and also demand of the people. And we could also, there's other indicators that show the problem in our economy, such as in the beginning we have a problem in the capital market and exchange rate in the early stage of pandemic. However, is starting to recover although it's not reached the previous level in the same as in the beginning of 2020. And also we could see the problem in the financial sector, which shows slowing down of credit rate and also increase non-performing loan rate. Inflation also lower due to the weakened domestic demand. And the latest figures also in August showed that the unemployment rate has increased quite significant. So this is the picture of the impact of the pandemic, which led to problem to the economic sector. So maybe I will focus more on the policy. Oh, sorry. Before that, I also will explain how the impact of the COVID to our export-import performance. In general, our both export and import growth has been contracted during the COVID period. For the export, you can understand that law of demand, global demand, and our major partner also create a contraction in our export growth. And also in import, having a contraction is larger than the export because as we know, the Indonesian activity, real economic activity is rely much on the imported input. So as the economic activity is going down, the import was having a problem, more severe, affected by the COVID and the slowdown of economy. This situation actually create lead to some advantage to our economy a little bit, as we could see that our trade balance surplus is increased during the years 2020. I think that's in general, we could see the problem and the impact of the COVID to our economy. This is, I skip this. This is only show the explain how the impact to the export by category and also import by BC category. So the situation, the risk of the COVID already realized by the government in the early stage of the pandemic. So since the beginning, the government basically issued a law. Previously, it's called Law of Law number 1, but already ratified by the Parliament, become to law number 2, 2020, and it contains the government response, how to deal with the COVID pandemic, and also the how to take a program, so-called National Economic Recovery Program. In Indonesia, we call PEN. Maybe all of you already heard about that. Some important policies in this law is that we've taken several relaxation to our
Mr. Karab, are you there?
Hello?
Yeah, yes. There's some technical disconnection. Can you go ahead?
Oh, sorry. Okay. So back to the law number 2. Basically, we have a relaxation on the budget deficit rule. This is the one of the most important rule. That originally we have a rule that the government can only take below 3% deficit to our budget. However, based on this law, we could now to take a higher deficit for the budget deficit over the threshold 3%. And also we provide some other relaxation by for reallocation the budget spending, and also we can issue another government debt to finance the program. And also other flexibility have been given to the other authorities such as Central Bank and Financial Service Authority. For example, for Central Bank, Bank Indonesia, now Central Bank can buy the government bond in the primary market. In normal situation, this action is prohibited by Central Bank's law. And also other relaxation is taken by the financial sector authorities to implement some lenient regulation in order to allow financial sector to support the real sector. So this is basically the program consists of measures to deal with health issues, to improve domestic demand, and also to help the supply side or supply side of economic activity. Some of the policies consist of like tax incentive, also import tax reduction, and also some relaxation on tax installment. In certain aspect, we also the government also provide fund for the banking sector. This aim to help the bank's liquidity caused by the non-performing loans and other problem from the debtor. So we hope this liquidity can help the bank to continue supporting the real sector. And also other measure is taken to help provide the spending for medical personnel and equipment, and also social protection and safety net program. This basically to help the domestic demand issues. And maybe I could I could mention some measures related to the trade. For example, we have import tax exemption. This is for equipment and product related to the pandemic handling measures. And also we provide tax exemption for sectoral in special region in bonded zone, and also for the industry that import that propose it for export product.
Mr. Karab, can you wrap up your presentation in a minute?
Okay, and we also provide speeding up the process of service and administration for traders, and also we provide special funding in the national interest account. We provide a special interest rate and relaxed requirement for certain sector and certain business, especially for SMEs. And other also increased spending for tourism related sectors such as hotel, travel agent, and etc. And other incentive also provide indirectly through the relaxation and incentive for the real sector. That maybe it's not directly directed to the trade activity. However, the survival of the industry will help our economy to continue our ability to export and meeting existing global demand. I think I finished my presentation right now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Karab, for very informative presentation on the Indonesians, how Indonesian government try to tackle the effect of the COVID-19. Thank you very much. That's very comprehensive, very informative. Again, I'm sure there will be many questions with regard to Indonesian cases. So we heard all the presentations from the ADB, WTO, ASEAN, and then the famous consultancy, and then also the Indonesian government. Now it's time to have a question and answer session. So we have around 20-25 minutes. So I think we have plenty of time. So I open the floor for the question and answer. First, I see the hands raised. Let me invite Mr. Karsten for questions.
Thank you, Deputy Dean, and thanks to the presenters for very, very interesting and insightful presentations. I really, really enjoyed them. I had two quick questions that maybe I could pick your brains on. And the first one is about cooperation, the issue of regulatory cooperation, which was raised by several of the speakers. And do you have any ideas of how we can ensure that this type of cooperation that we have seen emerging in the context of COVID, that we maintain it and even strengthen it? That is the first question. And the second question is more regarding the regulatory aspects of COVID. And my doubt there was, to what extent COVID was leading regulators, in fact, to reassess the necessity of some regulations that have been relaxed. After all, once these regulations have been relaxed, probably there were benefits seen out of them. So to what extent is COVID leading to reassessing those regulations? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the very insightful questions. With regard to first question about the cooperation, regional cooperation, whatever, in the global population, can I ask Shin-Young to respond? And then also the regulatory aspect, your second question, can I ask Devin at the WTO to respond? Shin-Young first.
Thank you. Thank you for the question as well. In fact, ASEAN have been making quite significant effort to facilitate the vaccine distribution and trying to arrange a mutual recognition agreements on licensing of drugs and also some of those critical medical goods. And as you have also noted that, I mean, quite a few other panelists that have mentioned as well, there have been a lot of the import facilitation and trade facilitations to speed up those import procedures for the critical goods, not necessarily only for the medical goods, but also even for food. And behind this trade facilitation was also the effort to streamline and harmonize regulations. And one of those included those mutual recognition arrangements. And this is a significant progress that the sub-region, at least like ASEAN, have been making regional cooperation efforts to promote the mutually recognized licensing and registration process of national drug regulatory agencies. And as you have, and quite a few other, the slides have shown the technical and then the phytosanitary sort of regulations that have been streamlined. And those will likely stay for these, especially the critical goods and then the medical supply chains. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Levin?
Yes, thank you, Deputy Dean. I think in response to the question about from Karsten, I think if we're thinking about the sort of relaxation of some regulations that may have been taken, I think it's useful to think about it probably in terms of a sort of hierarchy of objectives. So health and safety in an emergency situation like the pandemic obviously will take top priority. And so that means that maybe we have to accept that some other objectives of public policy may not be completely fulfilled at that time, whether it's, for example, giving full and complete information to consumers about a product, the product in question, its origin, etc. So I think that's an important question, how you reevaluate those priorities in the context of a pandemic. I guess that it may prove that over time, some of those measures were not necessary in the first place, and perhaps they will not come back. On the other hand, it may be that once the situation has improved, we may be able to, it may be the case that some of these measures will come back into place. So I think there's that type of question that has to be asked. But certainly on the cooperation aspect, I think it's important to think longer term about how, as my previous panelists just said, how this sort of mutual recognition can be further enhanced, how we can further build on what we've seen now. And there's a lot of useful models that exist in different areas, like for medical devices, for pharmaceutical inspection, which I think we can build on, and especially the test of how we will deal with the COVID-19 vaccine, the approval process. This will be an important question looking ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devin, for the answering the question. So there is a related question from the Familia Kribeli. Her question is that will the trade facilitation measures taken in response to COVID-19 pandemic be permanent? There are lots of the measures taken in ASEAN. So what about all these trade facilitation measures reported at the WTO? So would it be against the WTO rules to return to initial measures, original procedures? So I think maybe Mr. Trang is well positioned to answer this question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kim, for giving the floor. And yes, I have seen the questions on the screen in the chat box. So I'd like to provide some of my observations on how we view on this. So the question is about whether some trade facilitation measures, for example, like Article 4D through the single window, electronic signature on certificate origins, will it last permanently? So yeah, actually from the initial thinking and observations, we are thinking about to try to remove all the barrier to trade, to have our business community to overcome this trying time. And hence, we try to reduce the unnecessary administrative burden. For example, for the exporter, they do not have to go to the issuing authority physically to apply for certificate origin, because if they go to the issuing authority, they may get infected. So that would be very dangerous. So that's why we come up with some thinking that how to minimize the contacts between people and people. Then we're thinking about moving forward with the e-certificate, self-certification, and also even some ASEAN member states. Some ASEAN member states are able to accept the scanned copy, just like you just scan the hard copy and you send the scanned copy through the email to the custom authority of the importing country. So the importing country, they can accept that thing, and with the condition that the exporting country, they can provide the website which contains the real and true information about such certificate origin. So that could be accepted. So that very facilitated. And we taking into account that this measure really facilitate the trade, so it would be last permanently, because there's no reason why it could be abolished after the COVID pandemic, because it's already proved very efficient implementation, and we can have some measure to prevent any fraudulence, trade fraudulence, by have some verification tools and measure to prevent such fraudulence. So rest assured that such measure will be lasted permanently. Thank you very much. I hope my response already provide to some extent the question by the people who asked about it. With regard to the measure reported WTO, I'm not very sure whether the reader or the audience, he want to ask the WTO representative on that. So I just want to leave it to WTO representative here, so you can have a very correct answer to this. Thank you.
Very much. So, Devin, can you respond the question about the measures reported at WTO?
Yes, sure. So I think what we've seen is that initially many of them were reported as temporary measures, some lasting for 6 months, some lasting for a year or to the end of 2020. What we've seen recently is that a number of these have been extended. So members have notified that they will continue to apply indefinitely or until further notice. So I think it's a bit too soon to say what will be sort of the long-term, long-term impact, whether these sort of relaxed measures will continue to apply or not. But I think certainly I think one could expect that there would be some benefits that could be seen from the relaxed measures. So I think how you weigh that against the potential costs that they may impose, like I was saying before, for other objectives that governments may have. So how to weigh that out will be the key question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now there is one question related to vaccine. So from Mr. Dedi Surayo, the question is that with limited production capacity of vaccines, and also many cases around the world, as well as different trade facilitation policies, is there a special policy to ensure the equitable distribution of vaccines, especially in Asian region. So related to that, my question is that also, in addition to trade facilitation, it's very important to ensure the quality and the safety of vaccines. So are there any international the agreements to ensure such safety and quality? I think Matthias can answer those questions.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
This is a very, of course, important and urgent question that is in the mind of many people. As you might know, there is a COVAX initiative that is an initiative that was organized by WHO, CEPI, and also the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And we have currently 171 countries that signed up for this initiative. And the idea is that all these countries come together. We have also basically pooled funding to develop and also to distribute the vaccine. And the aim is to have 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. Of course, we want to ensure that the safety is ensured. The idea is in terms of distribution that all of these 171 countries get a fair share of the vaccines that are produced. At the beginning, they said 20% of the people should have the opportunity to get vaccinated, and these 20%, of course, are the ones that I most need. So these would be the frontliners, the people at risk. Now it seems that there are some considerations saying that in certain countries we have more elderly people, which are of course a high risk group. So some countries might get more than 20%, and then we also have countries with a very young population. Certain African countries, for example, Nigeria, the average age is 19, so they will probably get less than 20%. And of course, when it comes to the distribution of these vaccines around the world, again, trade facilitation plays an important role because some vaccines require a cold chain from the production to the distribution to the really up to the person that is vaccinated. So trade will play a very crucial role, and also all the distribution logistics that we use for other vaccines will be used extensively to distribute these vaccines. Now on ASEAN, I don't know what's the plan. Maybe our colleague from ASEAN can enlighten us on that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Trang, do you have anything to update or to add regarding the distribution of the vaccine? Mr. Trang?
Yeah, thank you very much. With regard to the distribution of the vaccines, I quite agree with the views shared by Matthias. And I think more importantly for the distribution of the vaccine, it's not only about the matter of trade, but it's also about the matter of social equalizations. And it's also about how to access to the medicine easily for everybody. Because if we just focus on the person or the people who are afford to pay for the vaccine, so even for the poor people who could not get the vaccine timely, so they will bring the virus back to the society. So it would be very difficult. So in this case, because I already have some time when I studied WTO regulation and it's about more the trade development. And this matter is much more about how to loosen, or even we can provide some flexibility in some access to the poor country on this medicine access to COVID-19, because we know that so far the recent trend is some high and advanced country who can produce the vaccine, but for the poor country, they are unable to do that. So perhaps I think there is the role of the WTO, who could focus more on this matter for the discussion. And hopefully it could become one of the very good agenda for WTO to focus on this one with the new WTO Director General. Yeah, hopefully she can have some clear direction on this matter. So that's one of the issues. For trade facilitation, we will try to create a more favorable condition for trading of medicine. So actually for ASEAN, we already put vaccine into the list of essential goods. And once the good under the list of essential goods, all the NTM or all the other measures, I mean the trade measure, will be refrained from imposing on such a smooth flow of such vaccine, medicine, medical equipment, and so on and so forth. So that's something the trade we can contribute for the distribution of the vaccine. But it's also, like I said earlier, it should be something about the social equalization and also the matter of trade and development, sustainable development. And also it could be about the matter of TRIPS, where we have to find some way forward to address the issue of copyright or something about the IPR. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So finally, there is a question related to personal protective equipment from the anonymous attendees. The question is that, first question is that the role of the government subsidy to promote the production of the domestic or personal medical products. Those subsidies is effective, and also should be permanent in order to do that. Second question is how can you identify the important products like a face mask in advance because of there are no reliable data in the domestic production. Maybe Shin Young, can you respond to these questions?
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a very, in fact, complicated and then a difficult issue because many countries have actually imposed the export sort of restrictions and trying to promote domestic production by reorienting the non-face mask producers to produce the face masks as well. But over the long term, you know, like is domestic or like regional production of all these critical goods are not sustainable solution for any country. In fact, the sustainable and then solution over long term would be, in fact, keep the economy open and then keep you know, the critical goods flow across borders. And many countries have also provided the financial support for the small medium enterprises, because actually these the surgical mask producers are oftentimes quite small manufacturers in many Asian countries. And during the peak time, in fact, because countries wanted to incentivize the firms, they do provide these you know, support, and then also trying to utilize trade finance to broaden the access to finance for these companies. And those are, of course, quite understandable from the policy point of view, but generally, is it like is again like is it like a really the sustainable solution? How many sort of like, you know, face mask, surgical mask producers are you gonna need once the pandemic is over? So eventually the question is, are we having difficulty to meet the surge demand, and then do we have a sufficient surge capacity through effective regional and international cooperation. It is important to keep the trade flows open, even especially during the pandemic. Like if the countries did restrictions and then made this supplies flow cross borders, it might have not been such a big crunch. But excess demand like this was really seriously unprecedented. It is more sustainable and important to keep the some of the reserve stocks cross border, like in the regional pool of these critical medical goods would be advisable, but also having the information clear and then also kind of timely updated, because many countries do have the database, and then with a lot of technology, especially digital technology, you can certainly update the production capacity, and then you can certainly have a large database of who's supplying and then who's actually exporting or importing. So close domestic coordination as well as the international cooperation to keep the information flow, and wherever the this capacity, like the production capacity is actually falling, then that's where we need to increase the production capacity and strengthen the financial support for incentivizing the firms to produce the real demand. Thanks.
Thank you, Xin-Yang, for the comprehensive answers. Finally, this is really the final question. There is a question about the credit guarantee system in Indonesia, not directly related to this kind of the trade facilitation, but Thomas Karaf, can you've already answered the question. Can you add something on this question?
Sorry, my connection is unstable. Maybe you can.
Yeah, there is a question about the credit guarantee system in Indonesia.
Oh yeah. Actually, credit.
Please be brief. Yeah.
Credit guarantee basically only for business activity, not for household. For household, we use the social protection program.
Okay. Okay, so then finally, one more question. I see the hand raised by David.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I wanted to respond on, just to add a point on the vaccines, because I think it's an important point on the sort of vaccine value chain. And I think, of course, we should, when we think about trade policy, there are many aspects which come in, from TRIPS, intellectual property, to regulatory issues, to border measures, to services aspects. So putting all these together will be a very important challenge, and making sure that the overall production, distribution, implementation of the vaccine is facilitated. In this point, I think also it's important to keep in mind that we're not just talking about the physical vaccine, but all of the related equipment, et cetera, that's needed to distribute the vaccine around the world and vaccinate millions, billions of people. So here, for instance, just if you're talking about a temperature-controlled vaccine, you need very specialized vaccine shipping containers, and there's a limited quantity of these. So how these are going to be used, how quickly they can be cleared at the border so that they can be returned back to the manufacturer to use again. So there are many questions about logistics and performance of border measures, et cetera, that will come into play, which will be very crucial to rapidly moving the vaccine around the world and providing equitable access. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe the discussion was very insightful, very rich, touching upon the important aspect of the trade facilitation in the medical goods and the vaccines, and then also standards, regulation, and the regional cooperation to combat against the COVID-19. So thank you very much for your all presenters for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and also thank you very much for all the participants for the active participation. Please join me thanking all the presenters and then all the participants for the active participation. So with that, let me close this session. We will continue our discussion about other important aspects of the trade facilitation. So with that, thank you, and over to Nella.
Thank you, Didi Kim, for managing this session one very efficient and very interactive discussion. And thank you for all the speakers, participants that actively contribute to this webinar. So we will have our session 2 about sustainable trade after COVID-19. And we will also have a keynote address from Professor Hal Hill from Australian National University about trade and COVID-19 crisis and Asia Pacific perspective. This session will be held on Thursday, November 12th, at the same time like today at 3 p.m. Tokyo time, 2 p.m. Manila time, or 7 a.m. Switzerland time. So, and then we will have the same link that you have today. So with that, I can conclude our webinar for today and see you again on Thursday. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you on Thursday.
See you. Stay safe, healthy, everyone.
Thank you very
Please.
much.